This is the Spyderco Caly 3.5. And this is a very pretty knife that isn't all that useful. So, the Spyderco Caly 3.5, much like the Caly 3, which I reviewed not that long ago, is a modern version of Spyderco's Calypso series. This is made in Japan. I incorrectly said that these were made in Seki City. These are made in another one of Spyderco's Japanese factories, but made to quite similar standards to Seki City and taking a lot of the same sort of attitude, same construction principles as what Seki City tends to do. You've got relatively thin blade stock here, 118 thousandths. Tapers down to a pretty fine tip here. You've got Spyderco's leaf-shaped blade, but extended on the Calypso series. So this is a long, thin blade with a choil just below the blade, a thumb ramp right there. So you naturally pinch there, and you've got a, right aligned with the pivot, your tip there. Pierces, stabs pretty naturally. We'll talk more about the blade later. I don't love this blade shape, but it's neutral. It's there. Blade on this one is ZDP 189 in a Sanmai, so jacketed with 420 J2. ZDP 189 is a very high edge retention steel. It is not stainless. You can see the Sanmai line right there, which looks very pretty. And this Sanmai is set up so that you get the high edge retention, but not stainless ZDP 189 steel there. And you get a more stainless and tougher steel along the jacket there. And if you look really closely, this one is a bit harder to see than the other one, but you can see in the light, like right there, you can actually see the jacketing even on the spine of the blade. It's a very cool visual feature. Sanmai's look really nice. There are some issues with this, which I talked about the Caly, and I'll talk in the Caly 3, I'll talk about briefly here. Then you've got the handle here. This is a decently big handle. If I put my mitts on here, I've got more than enough space for 4 fingers, and this whole thing is carbon fiber. And this is not carbon fiber G10 laminate. You can see on the edge there, this is carbon fiber the whole way through, and it is polished smooth. This is a smooth, slick surface on this. They call this gray. I mean, it looks pretty black to me. But this is full carbon fiber. It's polished, so it's smooth. And then you've got a backlock here, which is pretty nicely made, especially on this half, on the backspacer half here. Very nicely made it, actually. Very nicely finished. There's just a little bit of a chamfer all the way around, kind of like the Caly 3. This chamfer on the edges almost looks hand done in the sense that it's not quite even the whole way. Like if you look at this corner here, you can see it's not quite even on each side of that corner. That could just be the way they've set up their machining, but I wouldn't be surprised if this was hand done, this chamfer. Like you can see here, the chamfer on this corner here is not identical side to side. Stuff like that leads me to think hand finishing, and the price of this guy would justify a little bit of hand finishing. This is a made in Japan Spyderco that retails from Spyderco's site for $350. Now that is quite a lot of money. Obviously, you're not going to pay $350 from any retailer. That's Spyderco's got their typical markup there. This is probably in the high 200s from most dealers, though I don't know of a lot of dealers that are still carrying this model. It is still available, but it's not easy to find. And that's a lot of money for a Japan-made Spyderco. You see it in the materials, you see it in the fit and finish. A Sanmai like this is a pretty premium steel setup, much like the Caly 3. You've got a domed pivot here. You got your torque spin on the other side. You've got pinned hardware all here. It looks super classy. And the finishing, look at how nicely the steel, which is, you can see, slightly milled out. They just drilled some holes into there. But how nicely the steel meets with the carbon fiber. The jimping is nice. The plunge grind is typical Seki City, which is it's a little soft. This Spidey hole is a little bit soft. There's a little bit of softening on the edges here. It's a nicely manufactured knife, and with this carbon fiber and with sort of the visual interest the Sanmai gives you, it looks super classy. This is kind of like, I don't have actually let me go get it. My chaparral, this kind of feels similar to your little chaparral here, where this is a knife that is well made. The chaparral's better made than this. You know, if you look at your tolerances on the chaparral, they're even better along the backspacer, along the plunge, things like that. But, and the chaparral happens to be a cheaper knife, they're pretty good on this one. They're very good on this one. This feels in the same vein, where it's a classy knife that you can pull out in, you know, environments where you're around non-knife people, things like that. One of the big differences is this one ends up being less useful than this one. So let's go into a little bit why. Let's start with this blade shape. Now, the Caly is the Calypso. So this is Caly 3.5, Calypso 3.5. This is one of Spyderco's older lines. And this blade shape, you know, when I talked about in my Atom review, which I recorded not too long ago, the Atom works so well because this neutral blade shape here and the way the handle lets you climb up onto that blade easily means even though I've got a lot of blade here, I always feel connected to that tip. I always feel connected to where that blade is. And the same sort of thing here with your Endura. You know, even though the Endura doesn't have a choil, it has this little kick there. And just the way that this tip drops, it's a very natural blade shape. And I always feel like I'm in control of that whole edge. Even when I'm cutting and using the tip and holding it all the way back here, this whole edge is always very naturally sort of an extension of the line of my hand. And I know exactly where it is. I have not had that experience with your Caly 3.5 here, where this tip ends up feeling a little bit behind where I want it to be most of the time. And I've mentioned this before. It was the case in my Caly 3 review, and it's the case even more here. When I use the Caly 3.5 to cut with this blade shape, given how long and thin it is, and given the way the handle puts me pretty far away from that blade, and I can climb up, but it starts to get a little uncomfortable. With this aggressive thumb ramp here, works really well with my thumb back here. The second I start to climb up onto this blade, pinch grip it or anything like that, this thumb ramp doesn't work very well in this grip. It feels a little awkward at best in my hand. If I try to climb up even more, it just sits in an awkward place between these fingers, so I can't really pinch up on that blade. This is the closest I can get to pinching it, my thumb in the spidey hole, sort of like that. And the tip of this blade, the edge of this blade, I usually have to sight it when I'm cutting, meaning I have to keep track of where the edge of this blade is. It's just not as intuitive as a lot of Spyderco's better designs from a pure performance perspective. It's, you know, it gives you plenty of blade length and pretty much the whole thing is belly, so theoretically, this works really well for your long drag cuts, your long push cuts, going through lots of material. A thin blade stock will help you there. But something about, maybe it's the way that this blade sort of comes down and then the handle comes down here, which should be super comfortable. You know, it's a little bit of that pistol grip vibe to it. And it works well when you're cutting, you know, it should work well when you're cutting through like this. You know, your hand deflects down like this, the blade deflects down like that, and you've got a nice even arc. But this blade shape has felt a little bit unintuitive to me. And if you compare it to, say, excuse me, your blade shape on the PM2, your PM2, if you take the blade relative to the handle, it's more straight out in front of the handle, whereas this one deflects down. And basically, if you're taking, you know, if you're actually holding this, the line from the pivot, from your hand into the pivot, is sort of going, even though there's a straight line from the pivot out there, the line from your hand is a bit going, you know, toward the back of the blade. Whereas in the PM2, your hand is pretty much going straight out to the tip. This blade shape, this version of the leaf blade shape, and the way it orients relative to the handle, has been a lot more comfortable to use on something like the PM2 than the way that they do it here. I have unfortunately found the Caly blade shape to just be a little awkward, even though in theory it has everything that I like. In theory, it's got a great thumb ramp here. In theory, it's got a great choil. I've just found it awkward to use. The blade does cut very well. The thin blade stock helps. The Sanmai is very cool. It's probably not as necessary with ZDP 189 as it is with a lot of other steels. This is probably as much aesthetic as it is for performance. ZDP 189 doesn't corrode that easily. I've got Spyderco knives that are full ZDP 189, or I had. I guess I've sold all of them by now, and they would they would take on a little bit of patina here and there, but they're just fine. There's no patina on the exposed ZDP 189 here. Yes, does this jacket give you a little bit more toughness? Probably. But it also, like the jacket on the Caly 3, scuffs and takes on wear very easily. Yes, I had a comment on my last video, which was correct. You can acid wash this. You can do all sorts of stuff to make this blade look better. And by the way, if you're the sort that mods your knives, acid wash, sand my Spyderco blades look awesome. Big Brown Bear did that with a V-Toku one. Turned out great. But I really think this jacket on ZDP 189 is probably aesthetic and for the cool factor, which is there, than it is for really performance. ZDP 189 is a great performer steel. I've had the same issue with this steel that I had with my Caly 3. It very easily becomes very glassy. It's a little bit hard when I sharpen this to get the kind of micro serration, the little teeth that I want to have on a working edge. If I compare this even to, the Spyderco I just brought out is Maximate. This Maximate will get a toothy edge that when I start cutting into something will bite and pull and start that cut. This ZDP 189, every time I sharpen it, it kind of sucks as a performer for the first couple times I use it until that edge wears off a bit, and then I start to get those micro serrations back. I could just sharpen it at a higher grit, but then I'm sharpening, or at a lower grit, but then I'm sharpening it more often. It does hold an edge for a long time, but it does glass out a little bit easily. I like the steel on this blade. I don't love it. I don't love Spyderco's ZDP 189. It's objectively a good performing steel. High edge retention, good enough corrosion resistance. It's not tough, but it's not tough either. It's just, it's a good high-performing steel. But in this blade shape, I found it awkward to use anyway, so it doesn't matter all that much. Onto this handle. This handle is better than on the Caly 3. And it's not because it's longer. Sorry for the noise there. It's because the way that this hump is situated, it ends up having more meat where it should be in the hand. One of my issues with the Caly 3 is it ends up creating a lot of gaps in your hand. When you grip it this way, it creates a gap right behind the spine of the knife, and it never quite fits neatly in your fingers or in your palm. It's hard to grab onto, especially in that palm grip. This guy here, the swell, when I grip it in my hand, the swell, the widest part on the belly and on the back, does fit neatly into your palm, and so I can get a full grip that's nice and secure on this knife. And so the design of this handle, again, it's swept downward the whole way. There's lots of nice gradual curves. It's nicely knocked down on the edges. This is a nicely designed and comfortable handle by itself. And in fact, this belly here is done really nicely, where if I grab it, you can see my ring finger and my pinky are sort of on opposite sides of that swell when I come up in this choil. And it ends up being super secure in the sense that my ring finger is parking right on the edge of that choil, and it provides, if I'm sort of levering with my thumb up here against my ring finger back here, this is very secure. And this knife does not want to move in my hand. Even with a slick scale covering like this, part of the reason they can get away with a slick scale with polished carbon fiber is because this handle, especially with the anchor point this thumb ramp gives you, and the anchor point that this front choil gives you, which, this is a pretty stiff choil here. My index finger is locked in. This is a very secure grip. This knife does not want to move in my hand. And that comes with, all these curves I've talked about. This also comes with the fact that the whole thing is slightly downswept. That means that, my pinky here is helping to hold on to the knife. The whole thing is arcing, sort of consistent with my knuckles there. It's arcing toward the bottom of my hand. It's a thoughtfully designed, super secure handle that has contact with my hand pretty much the whole way down, isn't rough anywhere, and doesn't even really need that texture. I really like texture on my handle scales, but this is fine because the ergonomics of the handle are so good. And that does give you the benefit of the finish that this smooth carbon fiber gives you, which is pretty. I mean, who doesn't like this kind of carbon fiber finish? The chatoyance, the way it catches the light, it just looks high-end, it looks classy. Carbon fiber isn't that expensive a material these days, but people still Think of it as quality. Think of it as toughness. Think of it as performance, all that. And it gives you that look, and it's a very smartly designed handle for that reason. And this is sort of designed to be, again, kind of like the Chaparral here, a bit of a classier carry and a bit of a nicer knife in a much larger size range. Now, this isn't a light knife. You've got 3.5 ounces of, you've got 3.5 inches of blade, and you've got about 3 ounces of handle. It feels heavier than that because this is a pretty thin blade, so it ends up feeling a little handle heavy, and that's because you've got these full steel liners here. I mean, the back lock is right here, and then you've got full steel liners the whole way down. The back lock, by the way, has the exact same feeling that it did with the Caly, which is it is very smooth. And if you get a Spyderco Japan backlock that has steel liners the whole way, every single one of those I've tried has been very, very smooth. Now the problem, which is more aesthetic, oh, and super nice snap, nice bit of resistance at the bottom of the pull. You open it up, very nice snap when that backlock kicks in, nice fit and finish on the backlock. The Boyd dent here does help. Make sure your finger is always in the right place when you're opening it up. That's that little scoop here that basically makes it so, okay, your finger's in the right place. It is a, slow opener. You can shake it down if you want to, get it with one hand, but I'm always sort of guiding the blade down with my thumb. It does have the little hike in the resistance. So you got pretty strong resistance here. Then I get to about halfway, and then right around here, the resistance pretty much disappears. And toward the tail end of this action, there's almost no resistance on that backlock. It just feels a little funny if you're accustomed to, the native here, the native backlock. The native backlock, the resistance is pretty even the whole way through. That makes it feel smoother. That makes it feel a bit better made. And if I even go over to another Secchi City here, and I look at my Endura, the Endura gets a little bit lighter toward the end, but it's pretty even the whole way out. And that's the same with, your Endura, your Delica, stuff like that. This one here, the spring tension is just a little bit less even the whole way. That's purely aesthetic. That's purely in terms of how it feels. There's nothing that isn't secure about this backlock. It's just another little quirk with this knife. And so where I end up with this knife as a whole is I really like this handle, and I like the idea of the Caly 3.5, and I think the Caly 3.5 is a better knife than the Caly 3. What they're trying to do with this blade shape, with this handle shape, it works better in this larger profile. This one, the way the handle fits in my hand, as much as I love the way this knife looks and love the way it feels, I really don't love the ergonomics of this smaller one. They just haven't worked for me. The ergonomics of this handle I really like. This handle is comfortable in the hand. This handle works, in a few different grips. Not as many grips as a modern Spyderco design, but you can choke up, you can choke back, and the way this curves, the way those humps are there, it's gonna work nicely in your hand. The detent is nice. The backlock is a bit quirky, but nice. The finishing on the handle is very classy, very nicely done. Is it enough to really justify what Spyderco is charging for these full retail? I'm not quite sure, because the fit and finish is still Japan levels of quality, not, Tai Chung levels of quality. There's still, just a tiny bit of space on everything. There's no play or anything like that. It's secure. There's no functional issue whatsoever. It's just not as, rock solid everywhere as something like what Tai Chung puts out. But I will tell you, as much as I enjoy this handle design, I don't love this blade shape. And I don't love how it's a little bit unintuitive. It's a little bit restrictive. I can't move around this blade with my grip the way I like to with Spyderco's. I can't really get up on this blade comfortably. Again, that hump there becomes a bit of a problem. If I compare this to, a neutral Spyderco, like the native, part of what I love about the native series is I can climb up, I can climb down. This pinch grip, I just feel like I always have a ton of control over the whole blade. This one, the blade always feels like it's sticking out the front of the knife, and the handle feels a little disconnected from the blade. I feel like if they put out a Caly 3.5 Wharncliffe, This overall design could work really well with a Wharncliffe. This handle that sort of drags down could work really well if you bring this tip down and you've got a tip that you just want to drag through stuff. I can already feel it. I can picture it. This, as a Wharncliffe, that tip would be so easy for drag cuts. You would have tons of control over it. It would be so easy to just pierce through things and drag that tip and pull that tip. It would be wonderful. This blade shape here, I'm just not as big a fan of. And so, great handle design, great handle execution, just an okay blade. Will it do what you need to? Yes. Will it cut? Yes. It's still got relatively thin blade stock. It's still got a Spyderco grind on it. The San Mai is probably unnecessary with ZDP 189 steel, but it's got some cool factor. And so this ends up being a Spyderco that's a little bit expensive, probably a little bit heavier than it needs to be. You know, you really only feel the weight because, one, it is pretty handle heavy. You know, your balance point is like back like here because it's got those full steel liners and it's got a backlock. It ends up feeling a little handle heavy, which doesn't help this blade. This would work better if it were a little more blade heavy. It's part of why you feel so little connection to the blade when you're using it, is because the weight, the balance point, is all the way back here. And so it feels like, I mean, a lot of times a knife, the way it feels really has a lot to do with where the balance point is compared to where you're trying to cut. And so if your balance point is all the way back here and you're cutting out here, you just feel disconnected from that blade. Especially with carbon fiber, which you think carbon fiber, you think light. So it's cool, it's interesting, it's priced pretty stiff for what you're getting, but it's classy. It looks nice. If you like this aesthetic, this blade will cut. It will do what you need. And in this primary grip, it's okay. It's okay. I would love to see a revision of the Caly 3.5 series, a true modernization of it, modifying this blade shape a little bit, keeping this overall handle aesthetic, keeping this overall handle design, keeping the backlock, maybe trying to make the spring tension a little bit more even through the whole action. There are good bones here, but I don't particularly love this execution. You might love it, and if you want this full carbon fiber handle, and you're okay with it not being quite as much of a performer as some other Spydercos, and the price doesn't scare you away, it's not a bad knife. It's just not one of my favorites from Spyderco. And those are my thoughts on the Caly 3.5. Hope you found this to be a good use of your time, and I will see you again soon.